They said the Bell plantation was built on swamp soil that never forgot. And even now, when the wind drags across that hollow field, it sounds like something breathing beneath the earth. The house itself rose from the murk like a memory refusing burial. 3 stories of pale wood turned grey by dampness, its shutters half-rotted, its windows veined with mould and memory. The cypress trees leaned inward, their moss-hung arms heavy with years, and the air always smelled faintly of iron and lilies, like a graveyard that had learned to bloom. No one knew when the house began to whisper. Some said it started the night the Bell family brought their servants from Natchez. Others claimed the land was already cursed long before the first board was nailed. What's certain is that the river behind the house moved wrong, too slow, too still, as if holding its breath. Mercy Bell arrived that summer, barefoot, her wrists marked by a rope that had been cut in haste. She was said to be 17, though her eyes belonged to someone much older, someone who had seen death and called it by name. When she stepped onto that muddy path leading to the plantation porch, the frogs went silent. Even the insects dared not sing. The mistress, Eleanor Warrenton, greeted her from the doorway, wrapped in mourning lace though no one in the house had died. She studied the girl with a gaze that weighed and measured. "You don't look strong," Eleanor said, her voice clipped and sweet as broken glass. "I am what I need to be," Mercy replied, not looking away. And in that moment, something invisible shifted, like a promise whispered to the roots beneath their feet. Days on the Bell plantation passed slowly, heavy with heat and prayer. The river would rise and fall without reason, and sometimes at night, the dogs would lift their heads and growl toward the water, as if seeing shapes moving just below its surface. Mercy slept in a small room beneath the attic stairs, where the walls oozed damp and the boards sighed like they remembered footsteps. Each night before she closed her eyes, she whispered to the dark. Not a prayer, not a plea, but a language no one else knew. The air thickened when she spoke it, and somewhere beyond the walls the river rippled in reply. The other servants feared her. They said her eyes glowed faintly by candlelight, that she never ate when others did, and that the dogs avoided her shadow. One evening the cook, Lottie May, found feathers tucked under Mercy's pillow, wet, black, and still trembling. She threw them into the fire, and the flames hissed like they'd burned something living. But Eleanor Warrenton saw none of this, or perhaps she did and simply refused to believe it. She cared only that Mercy obeyed. Each morning she rang a small brass bell, summoning her new servant to brush her hair, to fetch her tea, to light the candles in the chapel that hadn't been used since Eleanor's husband drowned in the river 3 years prior. The mistress never mentioned him. Not his name, not the night they found his boots at the water's edge. But Mercy did, quietly. Once, while brushing Eleanor's hair, she whispered, "He's still listening, you know." Eleanor froze. "What did you say?" "I said your hair's turning grey," Mercy murmured, smiling faintly into the mirror. Eleanor said nothing more. But that night she dreamed of water filling her lungs, and of a man's hand reaching for hers through the current, cold, pleading, unfinished. Soon after, the whispers began. That first faint, coming from the cellar where the wine had turned to vinegar, then from the hallway when no one stood there. The words were soft, slippery, like something breathing through the walls. "Mercy, Mercy!" And when Eleanor woke, her mirror was fogged over with river mist, though every window was closed. The servants started to leave, one by one, claiming illness, claiming God's warning. Only Lottie May remained, too poor to run, too frightened to stay. She told Eleanor one evening, "That girl talks to the water. The river calls her name." Eleanor laughed, though her voice trembled. "Don't be foolish, Lottie. Rivers don't talk." But that night, when she opened her window, she heard it herself, low, endless, like something murmuring beneath the surface. Not a current, not a breeze, a voice. And it was saying her name. One morning, Mercy stood barefoot on the back steps, staring out at the fog. Her apron was soaked, though she had not gone near the river. "The ground remembers," she said softly. "It doesn't forgive." When Eleanor demanded to know what she meant, Mercy only smiled. "You'll hear it soon enough." That night the hounds broke their chains. They didn't run away. They circled the house, snarling toward the river, tails low, teeth glinting in the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of rain and rot. And as Eleanor watched from the window, she saw something move along the waterline. Something walking upright, draped in dripping lace, its face hidden by the fog. The dogs went silent, and then, somewhere in that suffocating stillness, a bell rang, faint, distant from the house by the river. If you can still hear that bell in your mind, you've already stepped too far into Mercy Bell's world. Subscribe to Forgotten Census before the next chapter finds you first. They said Eleanor Warrenton was a woman who feared silence more than sin, for in silence she could hear herself, and what she heard, she could not forgive. Every morning she sat in the chapel that leaned toward the river, its pews warped by humidity, its crucifix eaten hollow by termites. The candles she lit burned too fast, like they were desperate to be done with her. She would bow her head, lace her fingers, and murmur words she did not believe. Her voice was soft, melodic, but empty, as though she had learned prayer not from scripture, but from the theatre of guilt. Her servants watched from the doorway, whispering that her piety was for the living, not the dead. Mercy Bell, polishing the brass candlesticks, said nothing. She only listened, her hands slow, her eyes lowered. But when Eleanor rose from her knees, Mercy's lips would move a moment longer, finishing a prayer that had no name. The mistress avoided looking at the girl too long. There was something about Mercy's stillness that felt like being watched by a reflection that moved slower than the mirror. That summer stretched like a fever. The river swelled and receded as if breathing. The air itself seemed thick with listening. Sometimes while Eleanor pretended to pray, the wind would slip through the chapel's cracks, whispering words she didn't recognize but almost understood. It sounded like laughter muffled under water. One evening she caught Mercy in the chapel alone, kneeling before the crucifix that leaned crooked against the wall. A single candle flickered beside her, and in its trembling light, Eleanor saw that Mercy wasn't praying to the Christ at all. Her gaze was fixed lower, on the dark patch where water stains had shaped something like a face. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharp with the instinctive fear of being caught spying on something she couldn't explain. Mercy turned, calm and slow. "Listening," she said. "To what?" "To what's left." Eleanor stepped back, the hem of her dress brushing dust from the floor. "You will not blaspheme in my house." Mercy smiled faintly, her teeth pale in the half-light. "Then perhaps you shouldn't have built it here." The next morning Eleanor found the chapel door wide open, though she'd locked it herself. The Bible on the pulpit had swollen from moisture, its pages warped, its ink bled into unreadable stains. On the open page, a black beetle crawled over the word forgive. The house changed after that. The walls began to hum faintly when no one spoke, and the mirrors misted from within. Eleanor forbade the servants from entering the chapel altogether. But Mercy still went, each night at the same hour, barefoot, her white shift trailing behind her like a funeral shroud. One night Eleanor followed her. She stood at the chapel door and watched as Mercy placed small things on the altar. Broken twigs, feathers slick with dew, a fragment of bone. Her hands moved with quiet reverence. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Take what she offers," Mercy breathed, "and leave what she deserves." Eleanor's heart beat loud enough to drown out reason. She stepped forward, candle in hand. "Who are you speaking to?" Mercy didn't turn. "To what listens when your God will not." The flame trembled in Eleanor's grasp. "You dare—" But the rest never left her tongue. Because at that moment the candlelight bent, stretched long across the chapel floor, splitting in two, then three, then four. Each shadow took shape like a body kneeling beside Mercy, outlines without faces, all bowing toward the altar. The air smelled suddenly of earth after rain, wet, raw, old. Eleanor stumbled back. The flame guttered out. When she struck another match, Mercy was alone again. The altar empty, the air still. "Dreams are louder here," Mercy said softly. "They don't end when you wake." Eleanor fled the chapel, her pulse hammering like wings against her ribs. That night she dreamed again of her husband, his eyes open underwater, his hand reaching up through the current, clutching her rosary between blackened fingers. The next morning, she found that rosary on her dressing table, dripping wet, mud clinging between each bead. The days that followed grew stranger still. The chapel bell rang, though no rope was pulled. The dogs refused to approach the threshold. And Eleanor, though she tried to keep her faith, began to pray less often, because when she did, she felt something else whispering the words with her, syllable for syllable, but slower, heavier, closer. She would lie awake in her bed and hear Mercy humming in the next room, low and sweet, the melody winding through the boards like smoke. Yet sometimes when she crept to listen, the room would be empty, and the song would still echo, coming not from within the house, but from below it. One evening, just before dusk, Eleanor finally asked, "Who taught you those words you speak?" Mercy looked at her for a long, still moment, then said, "You did." "I most certainly did not." "You did," Mercy murmured. "The night you asked for him back." The air fell silent. Eleanor's breath caught. She hadn't spoken that wish aloud since the night of the drowning, the night she threw herself to her knees on the riverbank, begging for her husband's return. She had whispered into the dark water until something beneath it whispered back now. As she stared into Mercy's calm, unblinking eyes, she remembered how cold that night had been, how something in the current had seemed to listen, how she had promised something, anything, if only he would come home. Outside, the river rose again, flooding the reeds. Somewhere in the distance, a dog began to howl. Mercy turned her head slightly toward the window. "He's almost home," she said, and in that moment Eleanor understood that her prayers had never gone unanswered. She had simply prayed to the wrong thing. The house shuddered with a sudden gust. The candles snuffed out all at once. And from the direction of the river came the slow, dragging sound of something wading through the water, each step heavier, closer, impossibly human. They said you could feel her watching, even when she wasn't in the room. And when she was, no one dared to look back. Mercy Bell carried herself like the air itself bent to her quiet. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her words hung in the air too long, like smoke that refused to fade. The other servants avoided her path, whispering that her gaze could sour milk, wilt flowers, stop a heartbeat if she chose. But they kept their whispers low, for fear she might hear them even through the walls. It was her eyes that unsettled most, deep and still, the color of the river at dusk. There was no white in them when the candlelight caught her face, only that endless darkness where reflection should be. When the hounds of Bell Plantation first turned their eyes away from her, the house began to follow. Mirrors clouded at her passing. The clock in the parlor stopped each time she entered, ticking again only when she was gone. Eleanor Warrenton noticed it first one morning at breakfast. Mercy poured tea with that same graceful precision, steady hands, head bowed. But when Eleanor looked into her reflection on the silver pot, she saw only her own face. Mercy's shape behind her was nothing but shadow. Eleanor blinked hard. When she looked again, the girl's reflection was there, smiling faintly, but her mouth hadn't moved. From then on, Eleanor could not eat without feeling watched. Not by Mercy's body, but by something deeper, something that saw through her skin and sifted her thoughts like soil. When she met Mercy's eyes, it felt as though the girl could taste her guilt. That evening, Eleanor confronted her in the hallway outside the chapel. "You stare too long," she hissed. "It's insolent." Mercy's reply came slow, almost tender. "I don't stare, ma'am." "I see. See what?" Mercy tilted her head, as though listening to something beneath the floor. "Where you've buried things." Eleanor stepped back, her corset tightening with sudden breathlessness. "You will not speak to me that way." "I didn't," Mercy murmured. "I just let you hear it." The mistress slapped her then, out of fear more than anger. The sound cracked through the hall like a whip. Mercy did not move. Her cheek turned crimson, her eyes calm as grave water. But in that stillness, the candles flickered, and every flame bent toward Eleanor, as if the house itself leaned in to listen. From that night onward, the mirrors in the plantation began to distort. Faces stretched, reflections lagged behind movement. Eleanor swore that sometimes, when she brushed her hair before bed, she saw Mercy standing behind her in the glass, though she was nowhere in the room. Once, she tried to cover every mirror with cloth. The next morning, each sheet lay folded neatly on the floor, and on every surface where glass should have been, condensation spelled the same word again and again. "See." The servants spoke of it quietly, of course, between chores over dying candles. One, a boy no older than 12, claimed he caught Mercy in the barn at midnight whispering to the dogs. He said their eyes glowed red, and that she had been feeding them something wrapped in cloth. The next morning he was gone, vanished before dawn, leaving behind a trail of muddy footprints leading toward the river. Eleanor demanded the truth. "Did you have something to do with that boy?" Mercy only looked at her, unblinking. "He wanted to see what I see." "And what is that?" Mercy's lips parted, but no sound came. only a tremor in the air, a pressure that filled the room like breath before a scream. Then, softly, he couldn't bear it. That night the hounds began barking again, low, guttural, their claws scraping the wooden porch until it sounded like digging. Eleanor, trembling, peered through her window. The dogs were not looking outward toward the fields. They were facing the house. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting nothing, fixed on Mercy's attic window. The next morning, the servants refused to enter her quarters. They said there were voices inside, not human ones. When Eleanor ordered the door opened, the hinges screamed and a foul dampness wafted out, like the inside of a grave after rain. The window was wide open, the bed untouched. On the wall above it, a single handprint pressed deep into the plaster. It was small, feminine, but the impression seemed burned, not made. Later that day, Eleanor found Mercy in the garden, standing in the long grass near the graves of her husband's ancestors. Her hands were clasped, her eyes lifted toward the sky. But there was something wrong with her shadow. It moved slower, its head bowed when hers was not. "Why do you look at me like that?" Eleanor whispered. Mercy turned, her voice barely breath. "Because I remember what you tried to forget." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I don't understand." "You will," Mercy said. "When you see him." That evening, the storm rolled in from the river. The air thickened with the smell of decay and iron. Lightning split the clouds, and for a moment the house was bathed in a sickly white glow. In that flash, Eleanor saw them, shapes moving just beyond the windows, walking where the graves lay flooded, and in the attic window above, Mercy stood again, staring down, her eyes two empty wells reflecting the lightning. Only this time, Eleanor saw her husband beside her, hand in hand, smiling. The thunder came too late to drown her scream. They said the invitation came without ink, written in something that smelled faintly of iron and river silt. No one recalled who sent it, but by dusk, the dining hall of the Warrenton house was aglow with trembling candlelight, and the long oak table, scratched, uneven, old as the land itself, was set for 13. The chairs waited like sentinels, their carved faces worn smooth by years of prayers and punishments. Yet only 9 souls had the courage, or perhaps the curse, to sit beneath the flickering chandeliers that night. Mercy Bell stood behind her mistress, quiet as shadow, her eyes lowered. Though she saw everything, the roast was heavy on the air, thick with spice and something else, something wrong. When the servants carried in the platters, their hands trembled, for the scent rising from the meat made the dogs outside whine and pull against their chains. It wasn't the smell of pork nor beef nor lamb. It was sweet, coppery, and too human in warmth. Eleanor Warrenton lifted her goblet first, smiling with the brittle grace of a woman who believed she owned the room. "Mercy," she said softly, not turning her head. "Why do the candles cry so much tonight?" Mercy's answer was nearly a whisper. "Because they know what wax remembers." "Ma'am." The wind shifted through the cracks of the hall. A low hum rose from the floorboards, the kind that makes the stomach turn and the spine bend as if remembering something older than language. The guests drank, though their throats fought it. The wine was blacker than it should have been, thick, almost pulsing. Eleanor laughed then, high and ringing. "You see, nothing to fear but superstition." But her hand shook as she reached for the platter of meat. Mercy watched her mistress's reflection in the silver. The reflection smiled before Eleanor did. One of the guests, Reverend Cartwright, dropped his fork halfway through the meal. He stared down at his plate, face pale, lips trembling. "There's hair," he whispered. "God forgive me, there's hair in it." Laughter died in the room, swallowed by something invisible. Yet vast Mercy moved to refill the glasses, her fingers careful, her breath steady. She leaned close to Eleanor's ear, her voice like a prayer turned inside out. "Some things ain't meant for blessing, ma'am," she said, "only for feeding outside." The chained dogs began to snarl, their teeth flashing white in the dark. The moon broke through the fog, and every window of the house reflected 13 faces. Even though only 9 were seated, the candles dimmed as if choking. The air turned thick, the color of rotting fruit. A low creak echoed from the far end of the table, an empty chair pulling itself back. Ready for a guest unseen, Eleanor's hand froze midway to her mouth on her plate. The slice of meat twitched just once, and then began to pulse with a faint heartbeat. Her eyes widened. The goblet fell, spilling wine that looked too much like blood. Mercy Bell didn't move. didn't flinch. Her gaze stayed locked on her mistress, her face calm. The other guests rose, chairs scraping, breaths quickening. But the door to the hall had already sealed itself shut, like a throat refusing to swallow. The fire in the hearth went out with a hiss, and in the sudden cold, something shuffled under the table, soft. A wet, dragging one by one, the dogs outside went silent. Then the smell changed again, heavier now, more familiar, the kind that makes the lungs ache with guilt. Eleanor's voice broke through the silence. "Mercy," she rasped, "what did you do?" Mercy raised her eyes for the first time that night, and there was no servant left in them, only a shadow that had learned to speak. "I only served what you gave." "Ma'am," she whispered, "the land just took it back." A single howl split the dark then, not from outside, but from beneath the floor. The guests clutched their throats as if something unseen had passed through them, and in the faint candlelight, they swore they saw 13 plates once more, each with its share of steaming flesh by dawn. The hall stood silent, the plates untouched. The dogs refused to eat their meal, their eyes wide and wet with knowing. And when the sun finally touched the windows, the 13th chair was still pulled out, waiting, its cushions stained darker than wine. They said the house began to hum after that feast, a low, throbbing sound that moved through the walls like breath through a dying throat. It began at dusk, when the candles burned uneven and the mirrors fogged though no one breathed upon them. And always, the sound seemed to rise from beneath the mistress's bed. The servants heard it first, those who still dared to sleep indoors after the night of black wine and cold meat. They whispered about it in the laundry room, over basins of brown water and soap that no longer foamed right. Some said it was the rats that had grown bold. Others swore it was the river's voice, clawing its way back up through the planks. But Mercy Bell only listened, her head tilted slightly, like she was hearing a prayer that wasn't meant for mortal ears. The Warrenton house had changed since the feast. Its corridors stretched longer than they should. The wallpaper seemed to breathe when you passed too close. And the air carried the scent of something sour and faintly sweet, like meat kept too long in a cellar. Eleanor Warrenton had locked herself away upstairs, saying her health had turned. But the truth was she couldn't bear to step over the place where the table once stood. At night, Mercy was sent to tend to her, to change linens soaked in sweat and to pour milk that curdled before it reached the glass. Eleanor never slept. Her eyes, once sharp and cruel, had sunk deep and wide as if searching for something she'd lost. "Do you hear it?" she whispered one night, her voice dry and cracked. Mercy stood at the doorway, candle trembling in her hand. "Hear what, ma'am?" "The singing," Eleanor rasped. "It comes from beneath me. It says my name." The room fell quiet, save for the faintest hum that slipped up through the boards. It wasn't melody, not quite, but rhythm, steady and unbroken. A woman's voice, low and deliberate, whispering the same name again and again, drawn out like the creak of a noose. Eleanor covered her ears, but Mercy did not move, her gaze fixed on the floor later that week. The servants tried prying the boards open. They found no rats, no insects, nothing, only packed earth darker than it should have been. When they touched it, the ground felt warm, pulsing faintly as if it had veins. They sealed it back up by morning, nailing the wood tight, though the nails bent as if pushed back from below by the third night. The humming grew clearer. It wasn't just Eleanor's name anymore. It carried syllables that no one could speak cleanly. Something old, like river words from a tongue long dead. Mercy began leaving salt in the corners, a trick from her grandmother. But the salt never stayed. It slid into the cracks like it was being drawn back to something hungry. Eleanor stopped eating altogether. She claimed the voice beneath the floor was asking for forgiveness. "But not from her, Mercy," she whispered one dawn, clutching the sheets. "It wants me to listen." Mercy leaned close, her tone careful. "Maybe best not to, ma'am. Not all voices speak blessings." The next night the voice changed. It wasn't humming anymore, it was laughing, soft and wet, like someone trying to remember how to sound human. The laughter rose and fell with the storm outside, and every thunderclap seemed to answer it, echoing through the house like something alive. Mercy awoke to find Eleanor sitting at the edge of her bed, her hair unbound, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. "I can't tell if it's under me or in me," she murmured. "It knows my thoughts before I speak them." The candlelight flickered. Mercy saw just for a moment the boards beneath Eleanor's bare feet bulge upward, like something breathing slow and patient by morning. The humming had stopped. The house stood silent, and for the first time in weeks Eleanor slept. Mercy checked on her, the sheets damp but still. Yet when she turned to leave, she saw the boards under the bed were no longer wood. They were skin, pale and stretched tight that night. The servants refused to stay. The dogs had begun to howl again. Pacing along the river edge as if warning something unseen, Mercy alone remained, standing outside Eleanor's door, candle dimming to a whisper of flame. A sound came from inside, not the hum, not the laugh, but a slow dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. She opened the door and the bed was empty. The sheets lay twisted, and in their center a dark stain spread outward in the shape of a hand. The floor beneath was split open, boards splintered and wet. From the hole came a whisper, soft and faint but unmistakable, "Mercy." The candle blew out without wind, and somewhere beneath her feet the earth shifted, not like soil, but like lungs filling with air for the first time in centuries. Mercy fell to her knees, one hand pressed against the trembling floor, and through the wood she could feel it, the pulse, the breath, the whisper of something calling up from below. The voice that had once spoken Eleanor's name now murmured her own when dawn came. The room was empty again, but the servants swore they heard two voices now humming beneath the floorboards, one pleading, one answering. And from that day on, the house never went silent again. It began just after sundown, when the sky turned the color of rust and the cicadas fell silent mid-song. The plantation's hounds, creatures that once guarded the fields and kept watch by the stables, lifted their heads as if summoned by a voice too deep for human ears. Then, one by one, they began to howl. It wasn't a sound of hunger or warning. It was something older, a low, unbroken wail that seemed to rise from the ground itself. As though the soil remembered pain, every window in the Warrenton house shook, every candle trembled in its dish, and somewhere in the upper room, Eleanor's empty bed creaked. The field hands refused to step outside. They whispered that the dogs had seen her, that Mistress Warrenton wasn't dead at all, that she had crawled out of the ground by the river and stood among them. Barefoot watching, Mercy Bell only listened, her face half lit by firelight, and whispered, "Let them sing it out." The dogs tore at their chains until the metal bent and their gums split. They clawed the dirt, digging furrows deep enough to bury themselves in. And when the moon rose high over Vicksburg, their howls began to match the rhythm of the river's current. Long, rhythmic, sorrowful, no one slept that night. From the kitchen loft to the fields, every living soul heard the chorus of beasts echoing through the swamp air. Even the frogs fell quiet, as if afraid to interrupt whatever communion was unfolding between the living and the damned. Mercy moved through the dark, like a shadow in her own home. She passed the broken windows, the sagging beams, the walls that still breathed from what had happened beneath them. And when she reached the back door, she found the hounds gathered in a half-circle, all facing the same direction. Toward the woods their fur stood in clumps, their eyes rolling white, reflecting no fire, no moon. But they did not lunge, they did not bite. They waited. Mercy stepped into the yard, her bare feet sinking into the mud. The air was thick with the smell of iron, rot, and the faint sweetness of magnolia that bloomed late along the water. A strange wind moved through the trees, whispering something in a tongue only the river knew, one of the dogs. The oldest ash whined and lowered its head, its neck trembling as if in prayer. Mercy knelt beside it, her fingers brushing the fur that was slick with blood. "You feel it too, don't you?" she whispered. "The shifting?" The dog's chest heaved, and it made a sound halfway between a growl and a moan. Then it lifted its head toward the house, toward the room where Eleanor had vanished, and howled again, long and broken. The others joined, their voices weaving into one shrill, unified cry that shattered the air like glass inside. The servants fell to their knees. One began to pray, another covered her ears. Another ran to the door, but Mercy called out without turning. "Don't you dare," she said softly. "You open that door and they'll let her in." The youngest boy, trembling, asked, "Let who in, Miss Mercy?" She smiled faintly, her face unseen in the half-dark. "The one they're calling home." The night stretched on. The howls came in waves, sometimes rising to a frenzy, sometimes quieting to low, pitiful whimpers. But each time silence came, it was worse, because in that silence you could hear something else moving, Slow steps dragging through the grass, the faint creak of something wet and heavy pulling itself forward by the third hour. One of the dogs broke its chain completely. It bolted toward the tree line. Vanishing into the black, the rest followed, their bodies streaks of pale fur in the moonlight. The sound of their pursuit was swallowed by the woods. And then, nothing. Mercy stood alone in the yard, staring into that thick, trembling dark. The silence pressed against her chest like a hand, and then, from somewhere deep in the forest, came a sound that didn't belong to any creature she knew. It was laughter, low, wet, and familiar. Eleanor's laughter. Mercy didn't run. She only lowered her head and whispered, "So you found your way back?" The trees shifted, the air went still, and one by one the dogs emerged again, but they weren't the same. Their bodies were slick with mud, their eyes glazed and shining red, their mouths blackened at the edges as if they had drunk from the wrong water. They walked slowly, heads bowed. Encircling Mercy, none growled, none barked. They only breathed loud and ragged, as though echoing something buried beneath them. When dawn came, the servants opened the shutters and found Mercy standing in the same place, her dress soaked, her face calm, the dogs sitting perfectly still around her in a ring. She was humming, eyes closed. The same tune that once came from beneath the floorboards. The sun caught the edge of her jaw, and for a moment it looked as though her skin had darkened, not with shadow, but with the same river soil that had swallowed the Mistress. And then, as the first rooster crowed, the dogs lifted their heads and howled once more. But this time, it wasn't to mourn or warn, it was to obey. Mercy opened her eyes. "Enough," she said, voice low but steady. And at that single word, every creature fell silent at once. The wind shifted, carrying a faint scent of iron from the river, and somewhere in the distance, where the woods began to thin, a pale figure stood watching them all. The dogs began to whimper again, their bodies trembling, not in fear but in recognition. And Mercy smiled. The fog rolled in heavy, swallowing the yard. The dogs vanished one by one into it, as if stepping back into the swamp that birthed them. And when it cleared, only Mercy remained, her dress torn, her bare feet sinking slowly into the wet ground. From beneath the soil came a faint scraping sound, a heartbeat slow and patient. Then softly, almost tenderly, a whisper rose up through the dirt. "Feed her," it said. Mercy looked down, her breath trembling, and the earth beneath her feet began to move. The river did not rise like water, it rose like a memory, slow, deliberate, and full of hunger. By dusk, the air had gone thick and metallic, and the sky hung low, swollen with clouds that refused to break. Yet the ground glistened wet beneath bare feet, as if the rain had already fallen from somewhere unseen. The Bell plantation slept uneasily that evening, every window shut, every candle dimmed, every breath drawn shallow. But even behind locked doors, the smell of the river reached them. Iron, decay, and something else, something sweet and old. By midnight, the fields were gone. The fence posts vanished beneath a moving skin of black water. It came without sound. No wind, no thunder, just the quiet swell of something ancient pushing through the earth. The servants gathered near the parlor, huddled together, whispering prayers they half remembered from childhood. But Mercy Bell did not pray. She stood by the window, watching the moon vanish behind the rising mist. "The river's come for what's hers," muttered one of the older women, voice trembling. Mercy did not look away. Her tone soft but final. She was promised it. Outside, the current lapped against the steps, a sound like breath against wood, like someone whispering from beneath the floorboards again. Each wave brought with it the stench of turned graves and swollen roots. And beneath the shifting surface, faint shapes moved, slow, deliberate, almost human by the time the first candle died. The parlor was already knee-deep in black water. The servants clung to each other, skirts floating like pale ghosts. "Should we run?" one asked, voice barely a whisper. Mercy shook her head. "You can't run from a river you're part of." The water crept higher, swallowing the furniture. The piano moaned as its keys dissolved into silence, and from somewhere outside, the dogs began to howl again, a faint, broken, as if carried by the current itself one by one. The candles snuffed out, not by wind or by hand, but as though unseen lips had kissed them closed. Each time the light died, the house seemed to breathe deeper, and in the darkness that followed, something began to move upstairs. It was not footsteps. not the creak of wood or the rustle of cloth, but a dragging, slow and wet, like a body being pulled by the hair. Someone whispered Eleanor's name, though none dared to claim it. And the water answered, bubbling softly. As if amused when lightning flashed, it revealed what the dark had been hiding. Faces beneath the water, distorted, swollen, mouths open in silence, eyes milky and unblinking. Some of them were strangers, others familiar. Field hands long buried by the riverbank, a child who vanished one winter, the overseer who drowned 10 years past, and in the middle of them, all floated a figure in a white nightdress, her hair waving like weeds, her mouth moving soundlessly in prayer. Eleanor Warrenton Mercy did not scream. She only stepped into the rising water, her skirts dragging behind her like a veil. The current seemed to part around her as she moved toward the center of the room. The others backed away, muttering psalms, clutching rosaries that melted in their hands. Miss Mercy, one pleaded. Don't go closer, it ain't her no more. Mercy smiled faintly, her eyes fixed on the pale face beneath the surface. I know, she whispered. That's why she's still calling. The water rose to her waist, then her chest. She reached down, her hands trembling, the surface rippling like a heartbeat. The river seemed to shudder at her touch, a deep vibration that shook the very beams of the house. And then the thing beneath opened its eyes. They were black, not empty but full, as if holding back an entire night sky. A voice rose from the water, layered and broken, not belonging to one throat but many. Mercy, it said. You called me wrong. The current surged, slamming her against the wall. The servants screamed as the floorboards buckled and split, water gushing through every seam like veins bursting open. From beneath, something vast moved, a pulse, a ripple. The river itself breathing under the house. The candles upstairs flared once before dying completely. In their brief light, they revealed the walls, each one slick and glistening, covered in small black handprints, not painted, not pressed, but rising from beneath, forming as if the dead were climbing upward through the wood. Mercy struggled to her feet, coughing river water. Show yourself, she hissed. If you've come to take me. Show yourself. The air went still then from the window. A shape pressed against the glass, pale, dripping, hair spread like roots across the pane. Eleanor's face smiled, though her lips did not move. From her mouth water poured endlessly, and behind her reflection, the river began to bleed. It was red now, dark and thick. The smell of iron filled the house until no one could breathe. The servants tried to climb the staircase, but the steps had turned soft. Sinking beneath their weight like flesh, Mercy turned toward the window once more. Eleanor was gone, only her shadow remained, and in that shadow, something small and white gleamed. A bone floating gently, turning over and over as if waiting to be found. The water climbed higher. Brushing the ceiling, all sound vanished except for one faint, rhythmic knocking, like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. Then, through the blackness, came a voice, not Eleanor's, not Mercy's, but something older, heavier, unbroken by time. Mercy Bell, it said. The river remembers. The last candle sputtered and died, and the world went dark except for the faint glow beneath the surface, the shimmer of hundreds of eyes opening at once. The house groaned as its foundation cracked, and the river swallowed it whole when morning came. The plantation was gone. Only water remained, smooth and still, and beneath it something shifted, slow, patient, breathing. The dogs stood on the far bank, silent this time, watching the ripples spread outward, and one by one they began to step into the river. The night reeked of copper and candle smoke. The long table in the dining room stretched like a coffin laid open, lace torn, plates unmoving, silver catching the low light as if reluctant to reflect what it had seen. The walls, once pearl white, now drank the lamplight in dull hunger. Every object in that room, the chandelier, the portrait frames, even the clock, seemed to lean inward, listening. They said the mistress had not left her chamber in 3 days, that she no longer spoke, except in prayers no one had taught her. But when the clock struck 11, the bell of the great house tolled without a hand upon it, and Mercy Bell descended the staircase as though called from somewhere beneath the earth. The air changed when she entered. Even the servants waiting at the doorway felt it, that low hum in the bones, that suffocating stillness before something unnatural breathes. She said nothing, only walked toward the dining hall, her pale apron trailing over the wood like a winding shroud inside. The mistress sat waiting, her name, Eleanor, left on no one's lips for fear it might summon what now possessed her. She was blindfolded with a strip of white muslin, her hands trembling above the table, as if searching for invisible guests. Before her the supper lay rotted and still, bread blackened. "Meat sunken, wine thickened to clotted red, Grace," she whispered, voice soft as wet paper, for the blessed and the damned alike. The servants dared not move. One dropped a dish and the sound split the air like a gunshot. But the mistress did not stir. She only tilted her head slightly, as though listening for a word from something that stood just beyond sight. And then came the dogs, 3 of them, large, white-coated hounds that once guarded the estate's perimeter. Their chains dragged behind them, metal biting into the silence. They did not snarl or bark, only trembled as if awaiting command. Their eyes were milked white, gleaming faintly in the candlelight. "Sit," said Mercy softly. The word was gentle, but it carried a weight that made the room flinch. The dogs obeyed, lowering themselves to the floor beside Eleanor's chair, heads bowed like children caught in prayer. Mercy stood behind the mistress now, her face unreadable. Her hands folded in quiet reverence. "You've kept them hungry," she murmured, her tone almost kind. "And yet you still pray they'll protect you." No one breathed. The clock on the mantel stopped. The mistress opened her mouth to speak, but only a sigh came, low, mournful, almost human in its pleading. "They know who fed them," Mercy said, leaning closer until her breath stirred the blindfold. "And they know who starved them," one of the dogs whimpered. Another pawed at the floor. The scent of iron thickened, though no blood had yet been spilled. "Mercy," whispered one of the servants from the hall, his voice breaking. "What are you doing?" She turned her head slowly toward him. "Only what she asked," she said. "She prayed for forgiveness, and I am Mercy." Outside, thunder rolled across the delta, slow and deliberate, as if the heavens themselves took note. Eleanor began to hum, the same hymn she had once taught the housemaids, though her voice cracked now, warped into a tune too old to belong to any church. Mercy joined her, harmony low and dreadful. Like 2 rivers meeting in the dark, the candles began to wane one by one, until only a single flame trembled between them, and when it flickered out, the howling began, the servants ran. They did not wait to see what happened when the blindfold slipped, nor who fed whom when the prayer ended. But those who swore they reached the gate alive said the sound that followed, that wet, tearing sound, was not of beasts alone. By dawn, the house was silent again. The table still stood, the plates untouched. The blindfold lay folded neatly beside the chair, and beneath it the wood was clean, scrubbed spotless, as if something sacred had fed well and gone back to sleep. And in the corner, Mercy Bell's apron hung from a nail, still damp at the hem. The next chapter waits where the candle burns blue, and the dogs have learned to whisper her name. If you heard the chains tonight, you're already part of the story. Subscribe to Forgotten Census before the light fades, and we'll keep the candles burning for you. The morning did not come all at once. It seeped pale and cold through the ruined shutters, like the breath of something that had forgotten how to be light. The house sat hushed, too hushed, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, unwilling to remember what the night had done. The air was thick with that terrible perfume of copper and lilac, of blood gone still and flowers that bloomed too close to graves. Even the birds refused to sing. The wind carried no sound but the faintest chewing, slow and wet, somewhere out in the fields. They said the dogs had been quiet at last, but not because they'd slept by dawn. The servants gathered at the edge of the veranda, eyes red, faces grey with ash and disbelief. None dared cross the threshold, not even to fetch water. The doors hung open, but the rooms beyond were not empty. No, they felt occupied by something that had eaten its fill and decided to stay. A new master, one made of silence, from where they stood. They could see the dining hall, the overturned chair, the long table still set for supper. No body, no sign of struggle. Only the blindfold folded neatly upon the tablecloth, and on the floor beneath paw prints in a perfect ring, pressed deep into the wood as if burned there. Elias, the stable hand, was the first to whisper. "Mercy's gone," he said, though his voice quivered as if unsure whether to sound afraid or relieved. No one replied. Instead, the cook pointed toward the chimney, to the thin plume of smoke still rising from the kitchen, steady as prayer. The others turned to look. No fire should have lived through the storm, yet the brick glowed faintly red, as though something within refused to die down. They followed the scent, that mingling of burnt sugar and flesh, of sanctity defiled. When they reached the kitchen door, they found the room blackened to bone. Pots melted, windows cracked, the once white walls streaked in soot like claw marks, and there, scrawled in the ash across the hearthstone, were the words, "No one could." Bear to read aloud. Mercy was given. It was written not in chalk nor coal, but with something darker, something that had dripped rather than been drawn. The letters still glistened faintly in the low morning light, pulsing like a wound trying to breathe behind them. A pot clattered, though no one had touched it. Elias turned sharply. "Who's there?" he called. The silence that followed was thick and deliberate, like something thinking before it answered. Then came the low groan of wood shifting under weight, a floorboard somewhere above them. "She's still here," whispered the cook. "Mercy never left this house." The others fled then, stumbling into the open air, gulping the dawn like drowning men. But even outside, the air felt wrong. The fields rippled, though no wind stirred them. The crows that usually gathered along the fence posts were gone, replaced by white shapes moving slow and deliberate through the mist dogs. Dozens of them, wandering in from the cane rows, bellies heavy, jaws dark. They did not bark or growl. They only walked, calm, obedient, as if waiting for instruction. Elias stepped backward, his heel catching on the porch. "They're full," he whispered. "Full and still hungry." From the house came a sound, faint, almost kind. The echo of humming, a woman's voice. They turned as one toward the open doorway. Inside, the light shifted. Shadows moved along the walls in slow, rippling patterns, like hands brushing the wallpaper from beneath. Then came the creak of a chair, the soft scrape of wood against wood. Someone, or something, had taken a seat at the table again. The cook began to sob quietly, clutching her apron. Elias raised a trembling hand to the cross at his neck, though even that small act felt futile, almost insulting. "Don't pray," he murmured. "She's listening." The humming grew louder, a melody older than any hymn, older than forgiveness itself, the kind of song sung when graves are dug shallow. Then, a single, deliberate sound broke through the hum, a footstep descending the staircase above. Slow, bare, wet, and another, and another. The servants turned and ran, some to the stables, some to the fields, a few straight into the river mist that had begun to rise again, swallowing the fences, the graves, and the dawn itself. Elias looked back only once. Through the open doorway he saw the dining room flicker with light, not candlelight, but something deeper, bluer, like the glow of fire burning underwater, and at the head of the table he swore he saw her, Mercy Bell, standing behind. The chair where the mistress had once sat, her hand resting gently on its back, her face calm and expressionless. Then the light went out, and the humming stopped. By midday, the smoke from the chimney had vanished. The servants who fled never returned, though sometimes travelers along the Vicksburg road said they smelled lilac on the wind, faint and sweet, mixed with the scent of something that had burned too long, and those who wandered too close claimed. They heard it. The chewing in the dark was slow, steady, patient, as though the house was still feeding itself. The Bell plantation did not die. It was taken, dragged slow into the black mouth of the Yazoo River, as if the earth itself had grown sick of what stood upon it. What was left above ground looked less like ruin and more like surrender, a memory sunken beneath mud and cattails, timbers jutting from the riverbank like bones through rotted skin, the once proud columns leaning inward, as if whispering confessions to each other before the next storm. Pulled them under locals don't speak of that land now, not directly. They call it the Bend or sometimes the Mercy Ground, though no mercy ever grew there. When the floods return each spring, they say the water rises not from rain, but from what still stirs below, restless, patient, remembering, and each year, without fail, the river brings something back. It begins small. A child's shoe, a porcelain button, a brass candlestick clotted with mud, relics of lives that refuse to stay buried. Then come the bones, not whole, not clean, bent in ways no human spine should ever bend. Ribs fused like the cages of animals, skulls too long, teeth too sharp. Hunters who find them won't touch them, not even with a stick. They leave them where they lie and pray the current carries them away again before nightfall. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the bones stay, half sunk in the banks, twitching beneath the moonlight as though remembering how to move. It's said that's when the humming begins, low and steady, threading through the reeds, rising and falling like breath. It's the same tune Mercy Bell once sang while grinding corn, a melody too old to have a name, too soft to resist. Fishermen have heard it drifting across the water, echoing against the ruined cypress trunks. The bravest stay long enough to listen, but none ever last until the end of the song, because when it stops, something else answers, a single bark, sharp and hoarse, followed by another, then another, until the entire river seems to shudder with the chorus of unseen dogs howling from beneath the surface. And if you wait long enough, you can see them not as they were, but as they became, pale forms just beneath the waterline, their movements sluggish, their eyes dull and milk-white. They circle the place where the plantation once stood, their muzzles breaking the surface only to sink again, as if feeding on something just out of sight. Don't look too long, the ferrymen say. They remember faces. Once in 1893, a man named Hollis Dyer tried to dredge the area for lumber. His crew lasted 3 days. On the 4th, the water turned the color of rust and the river gave him back nothing but rope, tangled and frayed, smelling of lilies and meat. When his wife came down to the banks to search for him, she swore she saw a woman standing in the reeds, barefoot, eyes black as river mud, her dress clinging to her skin like burial cloth. When she blinked, the figure was gone. But the humming, the same soft, endless tune, came from right behind her. Hollis's wife never returned home. They found her bonnet days later, caught on a branch half a mile downstream. The people of Vicksburg learned their lesson after that. They built their homes far inland and stopped fishing that part of the river altogether. But sometimes when the water runs high, the flood reaches their porches anyway, and in its ripples they see things glinting just below the surface. Fragments of glass, buttons, rings, small bones like those of children or dogs, and always that faint hum. The preacher says it's the devil's lullaby, a warning. The elders say it's the river claiming what it's owed. But the oldest stories, the ones whispered between mothers and their daughters when storms roll in, tell a different tale. They say Mercy Bell never drowned. They say she became something else, something older than vengeance, something that feeds. They say she walks the riverbanks when the water is high, her reflection leading her by the hand, her shadow never quite touching the earth. The dogs follow her still, silent and obedient, their bellies dragging the ground, their mouths stained with things the river won't wash away. And if you listen close, when the wind moves right through the cane, you can hear her call them by name, all 13, the same way she once called them to supper. Then, as the first lightning splits the sky, her voice lowers. Softer than the rain, eat, the surface of the river stirs. The reeds bow as if in prayer. Somewhere beneath the dark water, something begins to move, slow, vast, uncoiling, and by morning, the current runs black again, thick and still, as though the river itself is sleeping off a feast. The Bell plantation is gone, but the river remembers. It keeps what it takes, and it takes what it's given. The mud may bury, but it does not forget, and every spring, when the floodwaters rise, the dogs come back to feed, not for hunger, but for loyalty, because the river too knows her name, Mercy Belland. If you hear humming near the water's edge after dark, you'd best not answer it, for the river doesn't give things back, and it only teaches you how to stay,